This happened in early September 2011 when I was 17. I'd passed my driving test about 5 months before, and this was the first proper trip that I'd done with just my mates. I drove us up to the Lake District to camp for 2 nights before we had to go back to college. It felt like a big deal at the time, as I had never driven that far with just my friends and was looking forward to having some time away from home. The campsite was pretty quiet. School holidays had just ended, so most families had already been and gone. There were a couple of camper vans near the entrance, but where we pitched up was right at the far side near the edge by the trees, and you couldn't see anyone else from where we were. We had one of those big tents with separate sleeping compartments that my friend had borrowed from his dad. It felt quite fancy compared to what I was expecting. The first night was great. It had been around 22 degrees during the day, nice and warm for September, and even late evening it was still very comfortable. We cooked on a disposable barbecue and just chatted until around 1 a.m. I woke up around 2 a.m. The first thing I noticed was how cold it was. Not just normal night cold, properly cold. I could see my breath when I looked at my phone screen, which didn't make sense because the temperature hadn't dropped that much earlier. The second thing was how quiet it was. No wind, no rustling, nothing. It just felt dead still, but kind of unnaturally quiet, if that makes sense, for being in a thin tent anywhere. I lay there for a bit and then zipped my sleeping bag all the way up and went back to sleep. The next day we decided to go for a walk, and then we stopped at a pub nearby to have some food. After that we came back to the campsite. That night we had a few cans we'd brought with us, nothing crazy, and just sat around the fire again. The other 2 went to bed before me. I stayed up about 30 or so more minutes, just staring into the fire whilst I finished off my last can. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was wind, then I realised it wasn't. It sounded like someone crying, a really faint woman's voice, and it was coming from the trees behind me. I stood up to listen properly to try and figure out what it was, and it stopped. Then about 10 seconds later, I heard it again from slightly further along the tree line, like it had moved. I didn't see any torches, no phone lights, no movement, and there definitely wasn't anyone camping behind us. It was just woodland, with no walkways through that part. Then I heard a twig snap off to my left, not deep in the woods, quite close, just inside the trees. At this point I was starting to get quite freaked out, and then there was another twig snapping over to my right. It wasn't like something running, it was spaced out and kind of random. The crying started again, slightly closer. At this point I was using a torch to try and see what was making the noise, but it was just a lot of thick bushes and trees, so I couldn't see that far in. This went on for about 10 minutes, on and off with sounds coming from different areas, and then it just stopped completely. I stood there for a bit like an idiot, waiting for it to start again. I had contemplated waking up my friends, but I didn't want to look like a wuss for no reason. I told myself it was probably a fox. I knew they made weird sounds at night that a lot of people mistook for people screaming and things like that. So I put the fire out and got into my section of the tent. It was just after 2 o'clock in the morning again. I'd only been lying there for a few minutes when I heard something right outside my part of the tent. Not crying this time, but breathing, slow and close, just beyond the tent wall. I went completely still. I could hear the faint movement of grass shifting, like someone adjusting their stance. I thought about waking the lads, but I didn't want to unzip anything and make noise. Everything went quiet again. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And then right next to me, I heard a woman's voice, very quietly say, "Are you awake?" Not whispered urgently, not aggressive, just calm, like she was stood there waiting for me to reply. I genuinely couldn't move. I stared at the tent wall expecting to see a shadow or something there, but there wasn't. I didn't answer, and I could feel my heart beating in my throat. After maybe 20 seconds, I heard 2 slow footsteps move away. Then nothing. No running, no crashing through bushes, just quiet again, and it was noticeably colder. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have at some point. In the morning, one of my friends asked if anyone had been walking around the tent last night. I hadn't mentioned anything at this point, so I said no. He said he'd woken up because he thought he could hear someone walking around. We checked around the tent as we packed up. The grass was damp, but there wasn't any clear footprints. Nothing obvious anywhere. On the drive home, I told my friends what I had experienced, and we couldn't find a reasonable explanation, as there was no reason for anyone to be over by our tent at that time of night, and definitely not coming from the woodlands behind us. I still have no idea who or what was outside my tent and why it was trying to talk to me. If you've experienced something you still can't explain, send your story to TheEndReel@gmail.com for a chance for it to be featured in a future episode. And if you'd like to hear more encounters like this, please subscribe. Until next time, keep your lights low, your curiosity high, and stay tuned for the next episode of The End Reel.